You are listening to File oh 07. Now, put on your headphones, turn off the lights, and brace yourself for terror.
I woke up startled, sweat dripping down my forehead, my chest rising and falling as if I'd just run a marathon. The clock on the bedside table read 3:17 a.m., the hour when the world's darkest secrets seemed to emerge. I tried to steady my breathing as the images from the dream know. The nightmare still pulsed in my mind. A woman, her disheveled red hair and wide, desperate eyes, was pleading for help. The scene was so vivid that for a moment I thought I could smell damp earth and hear the muffled sound of a rushing river. "You know where to find me, detective." Her voice was a whisper, laced with the echo of a sob. That's when I woke up. I got out of bed, as if pulled by an invisible string. The feeling of unease was suffocating. My bare feet touched the cold floor, grounding me just enough to think clearly. It wasn't the first time I'd had this kind of dream, but there was something different this time. There was urgency and a disturbing detail. That face wasn't unfamiliar. I went downstairs to the kitchen, turned on the light, and searched for coffee like a man seeking an antidote to fear. While the coffee maker hummed softly, I stared at the notepad on the table. It was an old habit, something I always did, whenever something felt too important to trust to memory alone. I grabbed a pen and wrote, "Red-haired woman, river, plea for help." With each word, the feeling that I was forgetting something essential grew, like a tumor. My thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of the phone. Who would be calling at this hour? The sound sliced through the silence like a knife, making me shudder. I answered hesitantly. "Detective Henriques?" The voice on the other end was familiar. Clara, the officer on duty, sounded tense. "We need you now. A body was found at Crystal River, on the edge of town." For a moment, I considered declining, but something about that dream and the call felt connected. The red-haired woman, the river, the plea for help. Swallowing my unease, I replied firmly, "I am on my way." As I drove through the deserted streets of the city, the images from the dream blurred with the sound of the tires on the wet asphalt. The light drizzle seemed to murmur secrets, as if the night itself was conspiring against me. When I finally arrived at the scene, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the surrounding trees, casting dancing shadows that seemed to watch me. Clara approached, her face pale, her eyes heavy with worry. "It's a strange case, detective. No signs of a struggle. It looks like she was placed there intentionally." I walked toward the body with hesitant steps, each one bringing me closer to what I already knew was inevitable. When I saw the victim's face, the world around me stopped. It was her, the woman from my dream. My stomach churned, but I kept my composure. I looked around, trying to find something that might explain the connection, but all I found was an emptiness that echoed inside me. Then, I noticed something in her hand, a small, crumpled piece of paper. I carefully retrieved it, ignoring the piercing stares of the other officers around me. When I unfolded the note, my heart raced. "You were too late, detective." The message on the note echoed in my mind as I stared at the woman's body. "You were too late, detective." Was it an accusation or a warning? I couldn't decide. The distant sound of the river seemed to mock me, each wave murmuring that I had failed in some way. Clara approached, her eyes searching my expression for a clue. "Something wrong, Henriques?" "Number." My response was automatic, but it was a lie. This wasn't the time to explain that the woman had already visited me in a nightmare that had somehow turned prophetic. I turned my attention to the scene. The body lay on the damp earth, perfectly aligned with the riverbank. There were no signs of a struggle, just as Clara had said. But something caught my eye. The victim's dress was impeccably clean, a vivid red that stood out against the gray morning. Whoever had placed her here had taken great care to ensure she would be found exactly like this. It was a display, a spectacle. I stepped closer and noticed something curious about the scene. The ground around the body was damp, but there were no footprints. How was that possible? Someone had carried the woman, or had she simply appeared there? Who found the body? I asked, turning to Clara. A couple coming from the neighboring town. They stopped to rest, heard the sound of the river, and stumbled upon her. They're being questioned now. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. The combination of the dream, the note, and the scene told me there was something bigger at play, something I couldn't ignore. My instincts, the ones that had saved me so many times before, screamed that this was just the tip of the iceberg. I need to see the footage from the nearest highway cameras, and I want the medical examiner's preliminary report as soon as possible. My tone was firm, almost brusque. Clara just nodded. As the forensic team removed the body, I returned to my car. Sitting in the driver's seat with the squad car's lights flashing in the rearview mirror, I let my mind wander. That dream. The woman had asked me for help. I had heard her, but I'd failed to act. Now she was dead. My thoughts were interrupted by the crackle of the radio. "Detective Henriques, we've got something strange here at the station. An envelope was left on your desk. No sender." The news put me on high alert. I started the car and drove back to the station in tense silence, every mile dragging like an eternity. When I arrived, I went straight to my office. The envelope was there, large, brown, with my name spelled out in letters cut from newspapers. I sat in my chair, my heart pounding as I carefully opened the envelope. Inside, I found 2 items, a photograph and a key. The photograph was of the dead woman, but it had been taken in a different setting. In the image, she was alive, smiling, her expression calm, something impossible to associate with the lifeless body I had just seen. In the background, one detail caught my attention, a wall clock showing exactly 3:17. The key was small and old, with a tag attached. On it, 2 words were written, "Room 8." I stood abruptly, my head spinning with possibilities. Who had sent this? Was it a clue or a trap? Before I could decide, the phone rang again. "Detective Henriques, it's the medical examiner. I've got something you need to see." His tone left no doubt. This case was about to get even stranger. The precinct felt quieter than usual as I stepped out of my office, the photo and key burning in my hands like living secrets. The occasional ringing of a phone echoed from a distant room, but the tension in the air was almost tangible. The medical examiner's call couldn't wait. I drove quickly to the morgue, the squad car's radio playing softly, just to fill the silence. My mind was in chaos. The note, the photo, the dream, and now the key. None of it made sense, and yet everything felt strangely connected. "Detective Henriques, thanks for coming so quickly." The medical examiner, Dr. Mauricio, greeted me at the entrance with a grave expression. He was a methodical man, with an almost irritating patience. If he looked this serious, something important had come up. "What did you find?" He led me inside, where the woman's body lay under the stark, cold lights. The vibrant red of her dress had faded, replaced by the pale gray of death. "It's what we didn't find that's troubling, Henriques," he said, pointing to the table of instruments. "No signs of violence, not a scratch, no marks of restraint, nothing to suggest a struggle or resistance." "Was she drugged?" Dr. Mauricio shook his head. "The toxin is unusual, a chemical compound we haven't fully identified yet. But what's most interesting is her heart." "What about her heart?" He hesitated before answering, a rare occurrence for such a confident man. "She died of heart failure, but the condition of the organ is peculiar. It's as if something literally drained all her vital energy." I tried to process what he was saying. A death without violence, without a struggle, yet with a result that seemed unnatural. "And it here is one more thing," he continued, pulling out a tray covered with a cloth. When he removed it, I saw a small metallic object, a pocket watch. We found this sewn into the lining of her dress. I picked up the watch carefully, its cold surface resting in my hand. As I opened it, a chill ran down my spine. Inside was an inscription, "Time is a circle, detective." I left the morgue with more questions than answers. The key from the envelope, the photo with the clock showing 3:17, and now this message. It felt like someone was leading me through a maze, knowing exactly how to unsettle me. Back at the station, I sat at my desk with the key in hand. Room 8, but where? A hotel? A boarding house? I called Clara, asking her to check the city's establishments with numbered rooms. As I waited, the office seemed to shrink around me, the weight of the case pressing down. Then, the phone rang. "Henriques, we've got something," Clara said, her voice tense. "An old hotel downtown. Room 8 is registered, but the place has been closed for years." Closed for years? Who would have access to a place like that? A sense of urgency propelled me out of the station. When I reached the hotel, its facade was a relic of the past broken windows, rusted signs hanging precariously. I entered cautiously, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. The silence inside was absolute, as if time had stopped. I followed the numbers down the corridors until I found the door marked with a faded 8. The key slid into the lock with unsettling ease, as if it had been waiting for me. When I opened the door, the smell of age and mildew filled my nostrils. In the center of the room stood a single object, a large mirror with a golden frame intricately detailed. I approached slowly, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. As I stared into the mirror, an image formed. It wasn't my reflection, it was the woman. She was alive, looking directly at me, her lips moving. "You can't save me, detective, but you can save the next one." Her voice was crystal clear, but it had to be a hallucination. I blinked, and the image vanished, leaving only my pale, confused face staring back. That's when I noticed another inscription etched into the mirror's frame. "Time never stops, but the past never leaves." What was happening? Who could be orchestrating all of this? And more importantly, who was the next one?
I spent a long time standing in front of that mirror, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The entire room seemed shrouded in an eerie aura, as if the air itself was heavier, oppressive. The phrase engraved on the frame echoed in my mind as I tried to ignore the cold sweat trickling down my neck. I pulled out my phone and snapped a photo of the inscription. The next step was clear: find out who the woman in the reflection was and what she meant by the next. The thought of another victim looming turned the situation into a race against time. I left the hotel feeling like someone was watching me. I glanced over my shoulder more than once, but the silence of the empty streets was almost reassuring almost. When I arrived at the precinct, Clara was already there, her eyes fixed on the computer monitor. "I found something about the hotel," she said, turning to face me. "It was closed almost 10 years ago after a fire in one of the rooms." "A fire? Which room?" 8. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. "Any victims?" Clara nodded, but her expression told me there was more to the story. "A woman died in the fire. Her name was Helena Duarte." But she hesitated, as if reluctant to continue. "Spit it out, Clara." "Her body was never found." A wave of unease washed over me. A woman missing in a fire. A key that led to the room where she had been. And now her reflection speaking to me. It was too much to chalk up to coincidence. "And T here is something else," Clara added. "She was a private investigator. She was working a case before she disappeared." "What case?" Clara's fingers flew across the keyboard, her eyes scanning the screen as if searching for a needle in a haystack. "A series of disappearances, 7 women, all in their 30s. None of the bodies were ever found." I sat down at the desk, my head spinning from the flood of information. The mirror, the watch, the note, and now Helena. It felt like the pieces of a massive puzzle were scattered before me, but the connections were still unclear. "What about the mirror? Did you find anything on that?" Clara shook her head. "T here is no record of a mirror like that at the hotel. It could have been brought there after it closed." I stared at the photo on my phone, zooming in on the inscription. The words felt more like a taunt than a clue. Time never stops, but the past never leaves. I picked up the phone and called an old contact, an eccentric historian named Dr. Unable, who specialized in ancient artifacts. If anyone could shed light on the mirror's origins, it was him. Henriques, what a surprise! His voice was brimming with curiosity. I need your help, Unable. It's about a mirror. I described the object and the inscription, sending him the photo as we spoke. There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by a faint sigh. This is intriguing. The phrase sounds familiar. There are records of similar mirrors used in ancient rituals, symbols of connection with what lies beyond. Beyond? Are you talking about something spiritual? That depends on what you believe, Detective. Some say these mirrors were portals to the past, used to reveal hidden truths. But beware, tampering with the past can be dangerous. I hung up, Unable's words reverberating in my mind. My natural skepticism clashed with the bizarre sequence of events unfolding around me. Back at the precinct, Clara handed me a folder. This just came in. Someone left it at the front desk without saying a word. The envelope was plain, with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message spelled out with letters cut from magazines. You have until midnight to uncover the truth, or she will be the 8th. The 8th. My mind immediately went to the 7 women Helena had been investigating. The next victim was in danger, and time was running out. I looked at Clara, trying to mask my unease. We need to move fast. But the truth was, I had no idea where to begin.
The clock on the precinct wall read exactly 7:32 p.m. when I decided that sitting there, piecing together theories, wouldn't get us anywhere. There was something about that hotel, something that eluded the casual glance. Clara, let's go back to the site. I want to take another look at the room. Are you sure? She asked, hesitation clear in her voice. Absolutely. The tension in the car was palpable as we drove. Clara kept her eyes fixed on the road, while I mentally reviewed the details of the case. 8, it felt like the number was haunting us. 7 missing women. Helena, the next victim. When we arrived, the hotel was even quieter than before. The twilight cast long shadows through the hallways as Clara gripped the flashlight tightly. Let's head straight to the room, I ordered. Room 8's door was just as I'd left it, slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for us. I entered first, and the unsettling sensation of being watched returned instantly. The mirror was still there, softly gleaming in the dim light. Do you really think this mirror has something to do with it? Clara asked, trying to mask her unease. It's not the mirror itself, but what it shows. I stepped closer again, hoping to see something anything but my reflection was the only thing staring back at me. Clara stood beside me, her expression loaded with skepticism. Look, this could all just be... Shh, I interrupted. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing down the hallway. Clara whipped her head around, pointing the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Probably just the wind, Henriques. But wind doesn't make footsteps that heavy. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The flashlight flickered, and for a moment, we were plunged into complete darkness. Clara, I am here. My hand found hers in the dark. The flashlight came back to life, and immediately I noticed something different. The mirror, it no longer reflected the room, but an entirely different setting. This is impossible, Clara muttered. The mirror now showed a room with antique, dust-covered furniture. At its center was a table scattered with documents. And next to it stood a figure, a woman, her back turned to us, shuffling through the papers. It's her, I whispered. Clara didn't respond. Her eyes were glued to the mirror, as if in a trance. The woman turned slowly, revealing a face marred by burns. Her eyes, however, were locked onto mine. Time is running out, she said, her voice a raspy whisper. Clara stepped back, pressing herself against the wall. What? What was that? Before I could answer, the image in the mirror shifted again. This time, it showed an old clock, its hand spinning wildly, stopping abruptly at 11:59. "We need to get out of here," Clara said urgently. But something kept me rooted to the spot, a feeling that if we left now, we'd miss a critical piece of the puzzle. "Wait, look." The table from the reflection now stood in the middle of the room, as real as anything else. There was no logical explanation for it, but there wasn't time to question it either. I rifled through the papers, ignoring Clara's protests. Most were old, incomplete notes, but one document stood out, a contract signed by Helena Duarte, dated 1 week before the fire. "Investigate illegal activities, Hotel Orquídea," I read aloud. Clara stepped closer, peering over my shoulder. She was investigating the hotel itself? Looks like it. But what had she discovered? And why had the fire occurred so soon afterward? Suddenly, the entire room began to shake. The mirror emitted a piercing, high-pitched sound as a crack formed across its surface. "Henriques, we need to go," Clara shouted. She grabbed my arm, and this time I didn't resist. We ran, our footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. By the time we reached the exit, the hotel seemed to be collapsing behind us. Outside, the weight of the night felt even heavier. I glanced at my watch, 11:47 p.m. "We're running out of time," I muttered, trying to steady my breathing. Clara looked at me, her face a mix of fear and frustration. "What do we do now?" I gripped the contract tightly, sensing that the answers we needed were hidden within its lines. "We find out who hired Helena." Back at the precinct, the contract pulsed in my hands as if it had a life of its own. Clara and I sat in the meeting room, spreading the papers across the table under the cold glow of fluorescent lights. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of our thoughts swirling in the air. "Here is the contractor's name," Clara said, pointing to the bottom of the contract. I had already read it, but hearing the name aloud made it all feel more real. "Eduardo Santoro," I murmured. Clara crossed her arms, her brow furrowed. That name rings a bell. It did for me, too. I searched my memory, trying to associate it with something, while Clara began typing on the precinct computer. The screen lit up with a quick search through police files. When the results appeared, we both sat in silence for a moment, digesting the information. Eduardo Santoro was the former manager of the Orquídea Hotel, fired just 2 weeks before the fire. The accusations? Embezzlement and gross mismanagement. Looks like Helena was hired to investigate exactly that, Clara deduced. But why? Who stood to gain from this? While Clara continued digging for more information, a thought struck me like lightning. What if Helena had uncovered something far bigger than embezzlement? Something that made her too dangerous to keep alive? I glanced at the clock. 11:02 p.m. Time was slipping away, and the urgency clenched my chest like an invisible hand. Let's pay Mr. Santoro a visit. Santoro lived in an old building in a distant neighborhood. The facade was run down, with faded graffiti under the yellowish glow of streetlights. When I knocked on the door, Clara stood right behind me, her hand resting on the gun in her holster. It took a few minutes, but the door finally creaked open. Eduardo was a short man, with thinning hair and hollow eyes that seemed to see too much. "What do you want at this hour?" he asked, his voice hoarse but not entirely surprised. "We need to talk about Helena Duarte and the Orquídea Hotel," I said bluntly. For a moment, he froze, his eyes locked on mine. Then, without a word, he opened the door wider and invited us in. The apartment was a mess. Stacks of papers, boxes of files, and a lingering smell of cigarettes filled the air. Eduardo led us to a cluttered living room and collapsed into a worn-out armchair, lighting a cigarette with trembling hands. "You are chasing the same thing she was, aren't you?" Clara and I exchanged a quick glance before I responded. What was she investigating? He let out a dry laugh, dripping with bitterness. You really think you know, don't you? Helena wasn't just investigating embezzlement. She found something that should have stayed buried. What? I pressed, my patience thinning. He took a deep drag from his cigarette before answering. The hotel. It's not just a building. It's... He hesitated, his eyes darting to a corner of the room. It's like an organism, one that feeds. Clara scoffed. That's insane. Is it? Then why are you still here? Why did the mirror show what it showed? My stomach churned. How did he know about the mirror? Helena found proof that the hotel was built on something ancient, something that... Eduardo stopped, his face contorting in pain. Before he could finish, he collapsed to the floor, clutching his chest. Eduardo! Clara rushed to help him, but it was too late. The ambulance arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. While the paramedics removed the body, Clara and I scoured the apartment for anything that might explain what Eduardo had been about to tell us. At the bottom of a drawer, I found a sealed envelope labeled, "For the Police," in handwritten letters. I tore it open, and my heart nearly stopped. Inside was a map of the Orquídea Hotel, but it wasn't a typical map. It showed hidden passages, corridors missing from the official blueprints. Look at this, I called to Clara, pointing to a specific spot in the hotel's basement marked with a red X. What's that? I think it's where we need to go. The clock read 11:48 p.m. Time was running out, and the feeling that we were closing in on something monumental was almost suffocating. Let's go back to the hotel, I said, and Clara nodded. Fear etched across her face. As we stepped out of the building, the wind howled, carrying with it a whisper that seemed to call my name. The night was heavy, thick with clouds swallowing the sky. The Orchid Hotel loomed larger under the dim streetlights, its windows like eyes watching us. Clara parked the car by the side entrance, and we stepped out in silence, our footsteps echoing on the wet asphalt. The tension hung in the air, taut like a string about to snap. Are you sure about this? Clara asked, her voice tinged with doubt. No, but when have we ever been sure of anything in this case? I shot back, gripping the flashlight tighter in my hand. She didn't reply, just nodded and drew her weapon, ready for whatever waited inside. We entered through the hotel side, where remnants of the fire still formed charred piles of debris. The air reeked of something acrid, a blend of burnt wood and a metallic scent, almost like blood. Here, according to the map, I said, pointing to a soot-streaked wall. She frowned. I hear is no door. Not yet. I stepped closer, running my fingers along the wall with deliberate care. After a few moments, I felt it a slight irregularity, a hidden panel, almost imperceptible to the touch. I pressed against it, and with a muffled creak, it gave way, revealing a narrow, spiraling corridor shrouded in darkness. Ready? I asked, masking my own unease. Always. We descended slowly, the sound of our steps reverberating in the claustrophobic space. The walls were raw stone, cold under my touch. Moisture seeped down their edges, pooling into small puddles that reflected the beam of the flashlight like glinting eyes. It feels old, Clara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Much older than the hotel, I agreed. The corridor ended abruptly at a heavy iron door, its surface etched with worn engravings we couldn't make out. Clara aimed her flashlight at them, but the markings resisted comprehension. I pushed the door, and it groaned open, revealing what lay beyond a sight that left us speechless. The room was vast, a subterranean chamber that seemed hewn from stone by hand. At its center stood a black stone altar, surrounded by symbols carved into the floor. The markings were erratic, yet they seemed to pulse faintly under the light, as though alive. What the hell is this? Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, a low, guttural sound filled the chamber, emanating from every direction. Did you hear that? I asked, already knowing the answer. Clara nodded, her eyes wide, her grip on the gun firm. We moved cautiously toward the altar, each step heavier than the last. At its top lay an object draped with a dark cloth. I carefully removed the covering, revealing an antique mirror, its gilded frame tarnished with age. "Another mirror?" Clara exclaimed, her voice edged with disbelief. "It's not just any mirror," I replied, a cold shiver running down my spine. I looked into my reflection, and the ground seemed to vanish beneath me. It wasn't just me staring back. Behind me, a vague figure moved, its eyes glowing like embers. I spun around, but nothing was there. "Let's get out of here," Clara said, her panic now bleeding through. Before we could move, the iron door slammed shut with a deafening clang. The chamber began to tremble, the symbols on the floor glowing brighter. The mirror emitted a noise, a collective whispering sound. "You shouldn't be here," a deep, gravelly voice echoed around us. I glanced at Clara, but she seemed frozen, her eyes locked on the mirror. "Who are you?" I demanded, forcing myself to stay composed. The voice chuckled, a sound that seemed to originate within my skull. "I am the answer you seek, and the price for it." The mirror shattered into countless fragments, the pieces floating in the air like shards of stars. Clara screamed as our flashlights flickered before plunging us into darkness. In the pitch black, the voice returned, now a whisper directly in my ear. "The truth lies in the shadows you fear to face." Then, silence. The darkness was absolute. It felt like the entire world had vanished, leaving nothing but emptiness around us. There was no sound except for our labored breathing, quick, uneven gasps. I reached out toward where Clara had been, but my hand met only air. "Clara!" My voice came out as a muffled echo, swallowed by the silence. No answer. Panic began to creep into my gut, but I forced my mind to stay focused. Something was happening, something beyond comprehension, and losing control was the last thing I could afford. I fumbled in the darkness, my fingers brushing against what felt like one of the stone walls. It was damp, cold, and covered in some sort of carving symbols or marks I couldn't make out. I traced the wall with my hands, hoping to find a path, an exit, anything to give me a sense of direction. Then I heard it. A distant sound, like a pounding rhythm. At first steady, then increasingly erratic, until it resembled something alive. "Clara!" I called again, my voice firmer now, but still met with silence. I began following the noise, each step cautious, as though the ground might vanish beneath me at any moment. The pounding grew louder, closer, until I realized it wasn't coming from outside, it was inside my head. Suddenly, a faint light flickered in the distance, like a candle flame swaying in the wind. Instinctively, I moved toward it, my heart pounding in sync with the rhythm in my skull. As I drew nearer, the space around me began to shift. The stone walls transformed into something resembling worn wood, and the ground beneath me crackled with dried leaves. The air became thick with the scent of damp earth, and the faint light grew stronger, revealing a setting I recognized. I was in a forest. It was impossible. Of course we were underground, but the twisted branches and the shadowy sky above were unmistakable. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered to myself. A voice responded from within my mind. Who said sense matters? I spun around, searching for the source. It was the same voice we'd heard in the chamber hoarse, deep, yet now it felt closer, almost intimate. "Who are you? What do you want?" I shouted, my own words echoing through the trees. A low chuckle reverberated around me, but no answer followed. The flickering flame reappeared, floating in the air as if it were leading me somewhere. With no other choice, I followed, anxiety mingling with a gnawing curiosity. I walked for what felt like hours or perhaps mere minutes. Time seemed to bend in that place. Each step took me deeper into the forest,
and the sensation of being watched grew stronger with every moment. Finally, the light stopped. It hovered before a hollow tree trunk, wide enough for a person to pass through. "Enter," the voice whispered again, this time surrounding me. The trunk seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. I hesitated, but something stronger than fear compelled me forward. I leaned in and stepped through, darkness swallowing me once more. On the other side, I was back in the subterranean chamber. Clara was there, standing motionless before the altar, her back to me. The mirror, which had shattered earlier, was whole again, but something about it was different. "Clara?" I called, approaching cautiously. She didn't respond, but as I drew closer, I noticed her hands trembling. Her gaze was locked on the mirror, as if something within it had ensnared her. "Clara." I reached out and touched her shoulder. She flinched violently, as though snapping out of a trance. "The mirror, it showed me things," she whispered, her voice frail and unfamiliar. "What things? What did you see?" She turned to face me, and the look in her eyes sent a chill through my bones. "We're not alone here," she murmured. Before I could respond, the chamber began to tremble again. The symbols on the floor glowed once more, but this time, it wasn't the mirror that fractured. It was reality. The walls vanished, the glowing symbols dissolved, and everything around us shifted. We were back in the hotel, but it wasn't the same. The hallways were warped, like a distorted reflection in a cracked mirror. Footsteps echoed around us, though no one was visible. Clara grabbed my arm tightly. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice steadier now. I nodded, but every door we tried was locked, and the corridors seemed to stretch, twist, and close in on us. Then I noticed something on the floor, bloody handprints leading to a single door at the end of the hallway. "It's that way," I said, despite the knot tightening in my stomach. "How do you know?" Clara asked, skeptical. I didn't, but something deep within me insisted it was the only way. We walked toward the door, each step heavier than the last. When we finally opened it, what lay beyond defied all logic.
The chamber was back, but now it was filled with figures people, or what seemed to resemble people. Their faces were blurred, as if made of smoke, but their eyes glowed, fixed on us. In the center, standing before the mirror, was a man. He wore a pristine suit and exuded an aura that made the air around him feel denser. "Welcome," he said, his voice the same one we'd heard in the chamber and the forest. Clara raised her gun, but he only laughed. "You've come seeking the truth, haven't you?" he asked, his piercing eyes locked on mine. I swallowed hard, unable to respond. "Very well," he continued. "The truth is closer than you think, but beware, it comes at a price." The atmosphere in the chamber was suffocating, as if the air itself was charged with electricity. The man at the center continued to stare at us, a cold, calculated smile fixed on his face. "Who are you?" Clara asked, keeping her gun pointed at him, though her hand trembled. He tilted his head slightly, as if the question were trivial. "I am merely a guide, a mediator between what you seek and what you are not yet prepared to face." "And what exactly are we seeking?" I retorted, trying to ignore the shiver running down my spine. "The truth." His voice was like restrained thunder, echoing throughout the room. "But before any revelation, choices must be made." He made a slight motion with his hand, and the mirror behind him began to glow intensely. When the light subsided, the mirror's surface no longer reflected the room but instead displayed something deeply unsettling. Clara and me, but in different circumstances. In the mirror, Clara was alone, sitting in an empty room. Her hands held a photograph, and her face was a mask of sadness and guilt. As for me, I was surrounded by people, but my expression was hollow. They clapped for me, celebrated me, yet something was missing in my eyes, like I had lost the essence of who I was. "What is this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man smiled again. What could be? What will be? What you are willing to sacrifice? Clara stepped forward, still holding the gun up. We're not here for games. Tell us what you want from us. He chuckled, a low, unnerving sound. What I want is irrelevant. What matters is what you want. The truth has a price. One of you must choose. Choose what? I asked, the desperation growing. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured toward the mirror, and the images changed again. This time, they showed something even more confusing. The two of us in a room resembling the one we had started in, but with markings on the walls and symbols that seemed incomplete. For the truth to be revealed, one of you must bear the burden. The other, however, will be set free. Clara looked at me, and in that moment, I understood the gravity of the situation. Is this some kind of test? She asked, her voice cracking slightly. The man simply watched, as if savoring the unfolding conflict. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. Finally, Clara broke the silence. I'll stay, she said firmly, though her eyes shone with suppressed emotion. What? No, I protested, stepping forward. This doesn't make any sense. We don't even know what bearing the burden means. She turned to me, placing a hand on my shoulder. You have more to lose. Your life, your career. I can't let you sacrifice that. And you think I can live knowing you are trapped here? No. We'll find another way together. There is no other way. The man's voice cut through our argument like a blade. The choice must be made now. I looked at Clara, and she looked at me. The weight of the decision hung between us like a suffocating veil. I won't leave you here, I declared. And I won't let you destroy yourself for me, she shot back, the determination clear on her face. The man snapped his fingers, and the chamber began to quake. The shadows surrounding the indistinct figures watching us started to writhe, as if reality itself was unraveling. The choice or the end, he said. There was no time to think. I gripped Clara's hand tightly. Whatever this is, we face it together. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could say anything, a blinding light enveloped us. The pain was immediate and excruciating, as if every fiber of my being was being pulled in opposing directions. Clara's scream mingled with mine, and then everything went silent. I woke up on the cold floor, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. The chamber was empty except for me. The mirror was shattered, its fragments scattered around me. Clara! I shouted, but there was no answer. I struggled to my feet, my head pounding. Then I noticed something strange. One of the walls had a new inscription, written in handwriting that looked like mine. She is safe. You made your choice. I stared at those words, horror building in my chest. Whatever had happened, Clara was gone. And I had no idea where to begin looking for her. The echo of the words on the wall reverberated in my mind. She is safe. You made your choice. Safe where? And what choice was that? The feeling that something had been ripped away from me lingered, as though an essential part of my consciousness was empty. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my thoughts. My trembling hand reached into my pocket for the notepad I always carried. For some reason, writing had always calmed me, a simple act that brought clarity. But when I found it and opened it, I saw something I didn't remember writing. Step 1. Discover the origin. Step 2. Look beyond the reflection. Step 3. Don't trust the light. The words were in my handwriting, but I had no memory of recording them. My mind spiraled into a whirlpool of confusion. What is happening to me? I whispered into the emptiness. The room seemed quieter than before, as if sound itself had been swallowed by the walls. I moved to the shattered mirror and instinctively began gathering the larger fragments. As I aligned them on the floor, my heart raced at what I saw. The pieces formed a sort of pattern, like an incomplete map. Carefully, I turned each shard over, noticing markings on their backslines and circles that, together, resembled a type of sigil. It wasn't something I recognized, but it stirred an unsettling familiarity, as if I'd seen it before, perhaps during one of the cases I'd worked. The silence was broken by a distant sound, a rhythmic dripping, echoing from somewhere outside the chamber. I grabbed one of the sharper mirror shards, improvising a weapon, and followed the noise. The corridor outside was narrow and claustrophobic, lit only by a flickering light overhead. The walls felt even tighter than they appeared, and the oppressive sensation of being watched bore down on me. As I turned a corner, I found the source of the sound, a rusty faucet dripping into a bucket. Next to it was something that made me freeze. It was Clara's badge. I approached slowly, picking it up with care. It was warm to the touch, as though it had just been pulled from a fire. The number engraved on it was smudged, but I knew it was hers. "Clara?" I called, my voice echoing. No response. I scanned the area and realized the corridor had no visible end. The flickering lights cast moving shadows, and it felt like they were alive. Closing my eyes briefly, I tried to recall. Something was wrong. Why was I here? What had we found in this place? And why did it feel like my own mind was fracturing? I kept walking, clutching the badge like a talisman. With every step, the sense of déjà vu grew stronger. The corridor seemed to repeat itself, the same faucet, the same bucket, the same rust stains on the walls. Finally, I stopped, exhausted. That's when I noticed something that made me question reality. At the end of the corridor, or what appeared to be the end, stood an intact mirror. The same mirror that had been shattered in the chamber. "Don't trust the light," I murmured, recalling the words in my notepad. But curiosity overpowered caution. I stepped forward, one foot after the other, until I stood before the reflection. What I saw nearly made me stumble back. It was me, but not quite. My reflection bore an empty stare, the same look I'd seen in the mirror earlier. Behind him, shadows writhed, taking on humanoid forms, indistinct figures, with faces that shifted constantly. My reflection opened its mouth, but not to speak. It smiled, and that smile was an echo of the man we had encountered earlier. "Do you think you made the right choice?" his voice asked, though his lips never moved. The reflection stepped forward, as if it could cross through the glass. And then, everything went dark. When I woke, I was back in the chamber, but something had changed. The shattered mirror was gone, and the figures that had once been mere shadows were now sharply defined, staring at me. "Welcome back," said a familiar voice. It was the man from before, but his appearance had shifted. He no longer seemed human. Behind him, Clara stood with her eyes closed, her expression serene. "The game is far from over," he said. And this time, I knew he was right. The feeling of helplessness wrapped around me, suffocating. My feet felt heavy, as if the floor had turned into a magnet trying to pull me in. The shadows around me, now more defined, seemed to be waiting for my reaction, as if they wanted to test me, force me to face something I wasn't prepared to see. The place that had once seemed lifeless now carried an unusual weight, an oppressive energy that made my stomach twist. The figure before me, the man who had once been a mere specter, was now more substantial, more real. His gaze was fixed on me, his eyes empty, but with something more, an intention. Clara, on the other hand, remained motionless, her eyes closed, giving the illusion of false peace, something forced. The contrast between her and the figure approaching me made my heart race. Something was wrong. This couldn't be real. "You," my voice faltered, but I forced my throat to work. "You did this to her?" The man smiled, a cold, calculated smile that made me question if he had done more than I could understand. "You are still trying to figure it out, aren't you?" he said, his voice muffled by the distance. "But the answer is never where you think. The reflection you saw is just a small part of the truth." My mind began to spin, trying to piece it all together, trying to understand what was happening. The feeling of déjà vu hit again, and I felt pulled into a distant memory, but the image dissipated quickly, like smoke. "The reflection," I murmured. "What is it?" The man leaned slightly forward, the shadow surrounding him stretching. "The reflection is who you truly are, detective. But you are so far from the truth you can barely see it. It represents what you've lost, what you've left behind. You can't escape it." His words were imbued with an uncomfortable truth, one I didn't want to accept. How did he know all of this? How did he know about my journey, my insecurities, the times I almost succumbed to despair? Clara remained silent, but her eyes, still closed, began to move slightly, as if something was calling her, or as if she were in a deep dream. "What happened to her?" I asked, the nervousness starting to consume me. The man made a slow movement, almost as if distracted, as if it were just another part of the game. "Her? Ah, Clara, the answer to her is simple. She's where you are now, where everyone is, lost between the shadows of their own mind." That hit me like a cold wave. A part of my brain wanted to question, to challenge that absurd explanation. But another part, the deeper, darker part of me, understood exactly what he meant. "No!" I shouted. "No, that can't be true. I'll get her out of here." The man let out a low laugh, almost inaudible. "You can't save anyone, detective. Not when the only thing you are trying to save is yourself." I wanted to scream, to fight against all of this, but his words seemed to carry an immense weight, crushing any resistance I tried to muster. The idea that everything I was doing, all my investigations, all my attempts to find answers, was just an illusion began to infiltrate my mind. What was real? What was happening? I no longer knew who to believe, and worse, I no longer knew if I was in control of my own sanity. Suddenly, the shadows moved. They were no longer just around me, as before. Now, they were closing in, taking the shape of human figures, but distorted, faceless, mere silhouettes that seemed to have a life of their own. A chill ran down my spine, an instinctive terror that made me step back. No, it can't be." My voice trembled, the words coming out like a muffled whisper, drowned by panic. But the man didn't seem to care. He just watched, waiting, as if the scene was unfolding exactly as it should. "You are close now, detective. Almost there. Just one more step and you'll see. The mirror is waiting." Those words, repeated in my head like a mantra, the mirror, the reflection. What did they represent? What did he want me to see? I went to Clara, my hands sweating as I touched her face. But before I could do more, she moved, her eyes slowly opening. What I saw wasn't Clara. It was Clara's reflection. I recoiled, gasping for breath, my mind completely confused. But before I could question what was happening, Clara spoke, her voice echoing in my ears like a desperate plea. "Don't look at him. Don't trust him. He'll make you believe lies." She was trying to warn me, but it was too late. I had already taken the final step. The moment I looked at Clara's reflection, the shadows gathered, and everything around me crumbled. And for the first time, I understood the real question the man had asked me. Do you believe in your own truth? The truth, or the lie? What I saw in that reflection of Clara was like a blade cutting through my perception of reality. It was her, yes, but it wasn't. Something was wrong. Her expression was vacant, her eyes lifeless, as though her spirit had been replaced by something darker. The shock paralyzed me for a moment. I couldn't process what was happening. Everything I knew was being undone before my eyes, like the truth I'd been searching for this whole time was now distorted, like a lie perfectly molded into the shape of a memory. I looked at the man, my heart racing. He was still standing there, waiting. His smile wasn't just cold anymore. There was something more, something evil in his gaze. He knew I was beginning to understand. He knew I'd taken the final step, and that there was no turning back now. You? My voice came out hoarse, almost inaudible. What is this? What's happening here? The man didn't respond right away. He just took a step closer, and his presence seemed to fill the room, every corner now weighed down by a pressure that made the air feel almost suffocating. "You've got the reflection now, detective," he said. "You are seeing what you really are, aren't you?" What you never wanted to see. His calm tone unsettled me, as if he were talking about something trivial, when, to me, this was a nightmare. My mind was shattered, the pieces of the puzzle scattered around me, and I couldn't find a way to put them together. I didn't know who I was anymore, what I was doing, or why I was here. Every second felt farther away from the reality I once believed in. I looked again at Clara, or more precisely, at that reflection of Clara. The emptiness in her eyes made a strange pain blossom in my chest, as if I were watching someone I loved disappear before me, helpless to stop it. "It's not her," I whispered to myself, the words escaping like a desperate prayer. But the more I said it, the more it became an empty echo, meaningless. Because, deep down, I knew I was trying to convince myself there was still something I could do. The man's shadow stretched around me, his eyes fixed on me, as if he were a spectator to my suffering. He didn't move. He didn't need to. He was in control. He always had been. "That reflection," he continued, as though this conversation were normal, as if everything happening was just a casual dialogue between old friends. "It's not just Clara's. It's yours. The reflection you saw, the one you fear. It reflects the lie you've built over the course of your life, the fear of facing the truth." A wave of panic washed over me, but I fought it. I couldn't let him win. Not now. The mystery, the reason I was here, had to have a purpose. I needed to understand. I needed to make sense of it. "What do you want from me?" I nearly shouted, anger swelling within me. "Why are you doing this?" The man stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate. I wanted to run, but something held me back. Something I couldn't see but could almost feel. He was inside my head. "What do I want, detective?" He paused, savoring my anguish. "I want you to see. Finally. See the truth. See why you are here. See why all of this happened. Because you never wanted to face what's really behind your search. You were so focused on finding culprits that you never saw the reflection of your own guilt." The weight of his words hit me like a blow. Guilt. He was talking about my guilt. But what did he mean by that? I couldn't understand. Suddenly, the room around me began to tremble. The shadows in the corners started to stretch grotesquely, as if something were taking form inside them. The fear I felt seemed to become an entity of its own, something that wanted to devour everything real. "What is this?" I screamed, trying to back away from the figures, but my legs were frozen. The man just watched, impassive, as if this were part of the process, part of the test. "This is you, detective. Every piece of you that you are afraid to face. Every lie, every mistake, every fragment you've tried to hide from yourself. But now, all of it will be revealed." The figures began to close in on me, their shapes still distorted, but now more defined. They moved with an unsettling speed, coming closer and closer. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was trapped here, with Clara's reflection staring at me, unable to do anything. "No!" I shouted, my mind beginning to unravel. "I don't want this. I can't see this." The man took another step forward, and his voice softened, almost like a cold melody. "Here is no turning back now, detective. You are seeing the truth. Now, all that's left is for you to accept it. Everything you've done, everything you've left out, everything you've tried to hide, it's here. Now, it's time to face it." With a scream, the reflections began to morph into something even more terrifying. The shadows took shape, but they were no longer vague figures. They were human, or at least, they seemed human. But their faces were distorted, filled with anguish and pain, as though they reflected something from my own past. I tried to scream again, but my voice failed me. The man was right. I had lost control. The pieces were fitting together, but I didn't want to believe it. What I was seeing was real, perhaps more real than anything I had ever experienced. "You'll stay here forever, detective," he whispered. And the truth finally shattered in my mind. The silence took over the room. My heart was pounding frantically, and with each passing second, my breathing became more labored. The figures approaching me looked like people I knew, family, colleagues, even victims from old cases I had investigated, but they weren't them. They were there somehow, representing something much deeper, something I didn't want to admit, but that was as clear as the shattered glass before my eyes. Each of those reflections carried an insurmountable weight. They were disguised accusations, as if the universe itself was staring at me, showing me what I had done, or rather, what I had failed to do. Each face, each expression, was telling me something I had refused to understand until that moment. I saw my sister's face, someone I never let go of, but whose pain from her passing I always hid behind the facade of an impassive cop. I saw the face of a witness who had been key in solving a murder case years ago, one I never investigated the way I should have. And I saw Clara, but she wasn't in the reflection anymore. She wasn't just an empty image. She was real there, staring back at me. Her gaze was filled with sadness, and at the same time, contained fury. "Clara," I whispered, unsure if the word came out as a question or a plea. I didn't know what else to do, what else to say. I was trapped, crushed by the feeling that somehow I had failed her. The man moved closer to me. He was nearer than ever, his steps echoing, as if marking the end of a long road. "So you finally understand, detective." His voice was no longer cold. It was laden with a sort of satisfaction, as if I had just completed the last part of the puzzle, only to surrender to the truth in a way I never expected. I tried to resist, tried to think of a way out, but all I saw were the reflections. They were surrounding me. The room was full of shadows, and each shadow was a part of me, something I had tried to bury. "I don't," I started, my voice faltering, my eyes already brimming with tears, trying to maintain composure. "I can't believe this. This isn't real. None of this is real." The man looked at me with a smile that seemed to know more than he was willing to share. "What you are seeing is your truth, detective. Your own lie transformed into reflection. Each one of these faces represents a part of your life you denied, a part you never wanted to face. I am just the mirror, the vehicle you need to understand what you never wanted to understand." I wanted to scream, but the words failed me. I was drowning in those faces, those figures that surrounded me, and the truth I feared so much was finally before me, like a storm ready to break, like a cliff pulling me into an abyss. "You knew the whole time, didn't you?" The man's voice softened, almost like a whisper, but as piercing as a scream. "You knew you were drifting away from your own humanity, distancing yourself from your soul. And now that you see everything, the question is, what will you do with it?" I looked at Clara, and a wave of pain washed over me. I saw her expression of loss, as if she had known me my entire life, as if she knew I was destined to fail. She was the reflection of my guilt. She was the consequence of what I had done, and what I had failed to do. "I don't know what to do," I murmured to her, feeling the despair take hold of me. But Clara didn't respond. Her eyes just watched me, and for a moment the space around me grew quiet, as if time itself had stopped. I didn't know if it was real, or if I was being consumed by an illusion. Everything felt so tangible, so close, and yet so distant. The man took another step toward me, and it was then that I realized the true nature of it all. He wasn't just confronting me with what I had done, he was showing me what I had become. And that, more than anything, was what destroyed me. The man was right. I was facing my own lie. He wasn't the villain. I was the one to blame. I was the reflection of my own condemnation. Everything you did, everything you failed to do, brought you here?" He spoke, his voice deeper, heavier, almost tangible. "Now, here is only one question left. Will you face the truth, or will you keep running from it?" I looked at the shadows around me, at the faces staring back, and for a moment, I was afraid I would never leave that place. But before I could speak, something moved inside me. A force I didn't know I had. The need to seek justice, to confront the pain I had caused, flared up like a flame. I needed to make things right. I needed to do what was right. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The shadows parted, and the room around me seemed to dissolve. Clara, that reflection of Clara, smiled. It wasn't an expression of sadness or vengeance, but of understanding. I knew what I had to do. Finally, I knew. The sound of rain pounding against the windows was deafening, or at least it seemed that way. I woke up with a strange feeling, as if I were being pulled back into reality. But something wasn't right. I couldn't tell if it was the warmth of my bed or the weight of mental confusion pressing down on me. When I tried to open my eyes, the light flooding the room made my head explode in pain. I instinctively tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, as if I were sinking into an abyss. My thoughts were cloudy, my vision blurry, but something told me I needed to get up. When I finally managed to focus, I looked around and realized I wasn't at home. I was in a hospital. The white bed, the sterile smell, the machines around me, all of it gave me the sense that I was in a place very far from anywhere I had been before. A nurse entered the room and looked at me in surprise, as if I were a ghost. He hurried to press a button on the wall, and within minutes, a doctor appeared. She had a serious expression, but her eyes were filled with compassion. She approached cautiously, as if watching me closely, trying to understand what was going on in my mind. "You are awake," she said softly. "It's okay. You are safe now." But that didn't make sense. I didn't remember anything. I didn't know what was going on. The last clear moment I had in my memory was Clara's case. The investigations, the mystery that consumed me, everything had faded suddenly, as if it were a dream. Something told me I should know who she was, but something didn't add up. Her voice. That voice. It was unmistakable. I looked at her with squinted eyes. Her face seemed familiar, but the name wouldn't come to me. "Clara, is that you?" I thought. She interrupted my thoughts. "No, sir. My name is Dr. Mariana Costa. I am your doctor. Clara. Clara who?" Those words, spoken so naturally, confused me even more. Clara. I had thought she was Clara, the woman I'd been searching for. The name echoed in my head, but somehow, she didn't belong in this moment. How could she? But she seemed so real. I felt lost, even more so after the words she had said. "You are safe now." I tried to process the information, but nothing made sense. I remembered the accident, the police station, and how my search for answers had brought me here. But how could all this be possible if I was now in a hospital, in a coma, with no idea how I got here? The doctor continued to explain that I had been in an accident. "You were hit while heading to the police station. The crash was severe, but you are okay. Now, all you need to do is rest." "Accident?" I repeated, the word echoing in my mind. I was going to the police station?" She nodded, but quickly noticed my confused expression. "Yes, an accident, but it's all right now. What matters is that you woke up, and you are going to be fine." Still trying to understand, I closed my eyes for a moment, but something bothered me. It was as if something was telling me that this wasn't true, that there was more to this story than she was telling me. I didn't know what else to believe. Everything was foggy, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. "It can't be," I murmured, trying to push the doubts away. I don't understand." She smiled with a strange look. "You'll understand. Just be patient." And without another word, she began to leave the room. Before she closed the door, she turned to throw me one last sentence, making my heart race. "Oh, and here is one more thing. Someone left a message for you. They said not to forget. The game isn't over." Those words, filled with mystery, made no sense at all. But something in my chest tightened. I didn't know what they meant, but they unsettled me. A final warning? A last piece of the puzzle? The doctor's words felt like an echo of everything I'd already lived, and everything I still didn't know. I was about to ask for more explanations when suddenly I felt a vibration in the room. A quick, almost imperceptible vibration. Something that seemed to come from the mirror in front of me. A flash. A distorted reflection. And then, there he was, the man. That face. He was in the mirror, staring directly at me. His penetrating eyes made me feel as if I were being pulled into a dark, deep place, with no escape. I couldn't understand what was happening. The man in the mirror seemed alive. But when I tried to move, when I tried to speak, he disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. The room grew cold. The mirror now reflected only me, but the feeling lingered. I didn't know what I had seen or what it meant, but one thing was clear. The game, if this was even a game, was far from over. Still stunned by what I had just witnessed, I stayed there, in silence, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed impossible to solve. What had I lived through so far? Was it real? Was it all part of a larger plan? And the man in the mirror, who was he? What did he want from me? I didn't have any answers, and for some reason that terrified me more than anything else. I knew for sure that the story wasn't over, and maybe I would never know the truth. And so, the story comes to an end. Or is it just the beginning of something even greater? The mysteries that surround us don't always bring answers, but leave traces that make us question everything we think we know. What did you think of this journey? If you found it intriguing, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the next chapter of this unsettling series of enigmas. The unknown is always lurking. Until then,